But still, tell me the how. Are you going to have a massive deportation force?
You're going to have a deportation force, and you're going to do it humanely.
What if they're applying for asylum? Isn't the law because Congress didn't change the law?
If they apply for asylum, we're going to hold them until such time as their trial takes place.
Where? Do we have the facilities?
We're going to build tent cities. We're going to put tents up all over the place. We're not going to build structures and spend all of this, hundreds of millions of dollars. We're going to have tents. They're going to be very nice.
Very nice tents, kind of like summer camp. Remember that? President Trump is now deploying the American military to the border, roughly 470 troops for every one migrant who was charged the last time a caravan approached in April. But the president might not think that cynical, nativist move is enough obvious red meat for his base a week before the midterm election. We'll tell you what he just told Axios about his impending attempt to circumvent the Constitution. Welcome to Morning Joe. It is Tuesday, October 30th. Along with Joe, Willie, and me, we have the president of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the book A World in Disarray, Richard Haass. Washington anchor for BBC World News America, Katty Kay. Editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine, Jeffrey Goldberg. And co-founder and CEO of Axios, Jim VandeHei, is with us.
Yeah,
and Joe, here we go.
Well, Mika, isn't it something that every president, every campaign will have their closing arguments? And you can go back, and whether it was Barack Obama or whether it was Ronald Reagan, whoever was running for president, they always had, and their own parties always had, their closing argument. This is why you should reelect us. This is why you should keep us in power. This is our message. This is who we are. Now, in normal times, the Republicans would use that tax cut that they passed. That was supposed to be their closing argument. Or perhaps the Supreme Court justices, or perhaps Donald Trump, bragging about remaking the judiciary, of course, lying, saying he's appointed more judges than any other president since George Washington. You could go down the line of things that you would expect. The economy. This president to use is his closing argument. But what Donald Trump and what the Republican Party that has now been completely taken over by Donald Trump is using is racism. And you see it in Donald Trump saying he's going to circumvent the Constitution with an executive order. He can't do that. He knows he can't. He's hoping there are enough stupid voters out there that don't understand he can't do that. You have people on right-wing talk radio and right-wing TV talking about the smallpox. Thought we eradicated that one. So, migrants are going to bring in smallpox and other diseases. You have the most outrageous claims. The president talking about tent cities. And get this, James Mattis couldn't even talk Donald Trump at first into keeping enough troops, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 troops in Syria to defeat and finish ISIS and to push back Iran. Couldn't talk him into doing that, and yet he's sending 5,000 troops down to the border when that's not what our troops need to do. Our troops need to be home with their families in between all of these tours. Because my God, these people are over 1,000 miles away. They probably aren't going to even get to the border. If it's anything like last time, maybe 12, 13 will be arrested. But again, it's not about anything other than scaring Americans and actually appealing to their most racist base instincts. And if it works, God help us all. I don't think it will. We've got a new poll we're going to talk about that shows Donald Trump's approval ratings dropping, which is not a surprise given his dreadful performance over the past week.
Well, the Pentagon announced it will deploy 5,200 additional troops to the southern border by the end of this week in response to a caravan of migrants from Central America.
Coming, actually, yeah, in response to nothing.
It's incredible. Yeah. The announcement marks the largest quick deployment of active-duty U.S. troops since the response to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. former officials told the Wall Street Journal. The troops, a mix of active duty, reserve, and National Guard forces, will join more than 2,000 National Guard members already at the U.S.-Mexico border, exceeding the combined U.S. military footprint in Iraq and Syria. Just take a second and think about that.
Absolutely insane. They're going to be staring
at
across the border at nothing.
That dirt.
And they are doing it. And
no
I guarantee you, Mika, the day after the election, they're going to start talking about pulling them back. If anybody ever gets down there, they will be pulled back because this is an election ploy. And it's a pathetic one because actually now Donald Trump is playing with the lives of the men and the women of the U.S. military, Mika.
At a time when we've had a terrorist attack on our democracy and on top Democrats and Trump critics, we're focused on the border. The top U.S. border security official estimates the size of the original caravan at 3,500 people. President Trump tweeted yesterday, quote, "Many gang members and some very bad people are mixed into the caravan heading to our southern border. Please go back. You will not be admitted into the United States unless you go through the legal process." This is an invasion of our country, and our military is waiting for you.
This is such a lie. How stupid? I mean, how stupid does he think voters are? But you know, it's worse than that because he's not only talking about the military. As we've already mentioned, yesterday we saw some people on Fox News actually seizing on the issue of this phony caravan, using dehumanizing language, trying to underscore their point in a way that really sort of sounded like certain regimes in the 20th century that we don't want to even bring up. Take a listen.
What about diseases? I mean, there's a reason why you can't bring a kid to school unless he's inoculated.
They're coming in with diseases such as smallpox and leprosy and TB that are going to affect our people in the United States.
We simply cannot tolerate the continued invasion of this country when Americans are suffering every day. The national debt is exploding. We have diseases spreading across the country that are causing polio-like paralysis of our children. It's one thing after the other.
Senator, you can't very well blame that disease on illegal immigrants. We don't know the cause of it.
I mean, Willie, this is dumbfounding. Fox News is now claiming that these migrants are so devious that they have the power to bring smallpox back to planet Earth. I just got to ask, how stupid do they think we are? And then I think about Sarah Sanders yesterday talking about Donald Trump winning by a massive majority of 63 million voters. And suddenly you realize just how stupid they think their base is.
It's all very insulting. I did a little homework, Joe, this morning. The last known case of smallpox. We just had the 41st anniversary. It was October 26, 1977. A hospital cook in Somalia was the last known case of smallpox. The World Health Organization, for the record, declared it eradicated in 1980. So let's just put that out on the table. And Joe, as we talk about this and we talk about the troops, for a man in the president who talks about how much he loves the military, he sure doesn't show them much respect here by sending 5,200 of them to the border in a place where there are already 2,000 National Guard troops and the Border Patrol. Does the president not have faith in the National Guard? Does he not have faith in his great Border Patrol that they can do the job that they do every day? They have the people, they have the weapons if they need them, they have Black Hawk helicopters. They can control 3,500 people now, and it will likely be many fewer than that when and if it reaches the border, on foot, walking with families about 20 miles a day if they're lucky. This is preposterous on its face. And as I say, I think it's just disrespectful to the troops that he's sending down there.
It is. And Jeffrey Goldberg, we've been saying this for some time. If you look back to the April caravan when there was so much fear and anger whipped up, it ended up arresting 12 people who tried to cross illegally. So if you just take recent history, they're suggesting that 12 people trying to come to America, getting arrested, is going to relaunch an epidemic that hasn't been around since 1980. Again, you look, it is a concerted effort from Donald Trump, his administration, and Fox News to whip up a frenzy, and now they're talking about smallpox.
Yeah, they're not only talking about smallpox. I note for the record that they're talking about leprosy, which I think is interesting because leprosy, of course, is the most famous disease in the Bible, and I think they are trying to actually trigger people who are Bible readers or religious people to think that in effect the caravan, the so-called caravan or the invasion or whatever they're calling it, is bringing biblical-sized plagues to America. I mean, it's not unclever. I mean, it's built on falsehoods, obviously, but it's not an unclever play. No, this issue is really remarkable. I sometimes feel like we're in a movie about a cynical political manipulator who's just doing whatever he has to do to get to the get through the midterms. You know, the truth of the border is, it is well defended and well guarded. I've been down there on many reporting trips. Millions of people cross that border every week, legally, some illegally. This caravan is it's a nothing burger, but it's very useful right now.
Well, you know, I actually have seen this movie before. Mike Judge did it. It's called Idiocracy, and I'm dead serious. You look at what Donald Trump is doing. You look at what Fox News is doing. This is idiocracy. They think that they're base. They think that Republicans are so stupid that they're going to believe all of this. I guess, well, you know what, though? Not everybody at Fox News would have been allowed to star in Mike Judge's film because Shep Smith, once again, told the truth, as Shep Smith always seems to tell the truth, about this so-called fantasy caravan. Take a look.
Tomorrow, the migrants, according to Fox News reporting, are more than 2 months away, if any of them actually come here. But tomorrow is 1 week before the midterm election, which is what all of this is about. There is no invasion. No one's coming to get you. There's nothing at all to worry about. When they did this to us, got us all riled up in April, remember? The result was 14 arrests. We're America. We can handle it.
Hey, Mika, I have 2 words for you.
Yeah.
Hottie toddy.
Yeah.
The people at Ole Miss have to be proud of Shep Smith because while people are spewing BS all around him, lying, and, you know, Jeffrey Goldberg talking about, he's talking about the Bible. Obviously, the people that are hearing this don't read the Bible that much, if they believe it, because, I mean, my God, the whole New Testament. You look at the story of the Good Samaritan. You look at Matthew 25, which, of course, somebody tried reading to Jeff Sessions and he had him arrested. Yeah. I mean, that's where we are right now. A guy tried to read one of the most important scriptures in the entire Bible, Jesus' message on how you enter the kingdom of heaven. And for doing that, Jeff Sessions had police officers coming in and arresting him. No, there is nothing Christ-like about anything that we're seeing here. But I will tell you, Shep Smith right there, he told the truth. And I know a lot of people in Mississippi have to be proud of him.
Well, I'm not sure what happens with other anchors and hosts and members of the media community, journalism. What happens when they say things like the things they said that I'm not going to repeat, that we just played on this show? Yeah. That's not responsible.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.